Okay, we're good to go.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the New Albany Plain Local Schools Community Wellbeing Forum with an emphasis tonight talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We welcome you here this evening, and we're looking forward to everybody, and welcome to the conversation that's coming our way this evening. Just as a reminder, this is actually one event in a series of events that we're hosting this year in our community wellbeing forums. Our first one was just a couple of weeks ago, where we introduced the R Factor to our newest families in the district and had the opportunity to share the work that we're doing there. And as much as I don't like not being able to come together in person, I have found that this format, this virtual format, has been effective. We've had about 350 people view that presentation from a couple of weeks ago. So as much as it's kind of uncomfortable not being able to be connected with everyone in person, it seems to be a format where it's getting the message across for us. And I think you can anticipate that our future forums will be virtual in nature as we go throughout the course of this year. We'll have another one in March where we're going to talk about digital citizenship. And as we think about just all the work that we're going to be doing this year connected to virtual learning opportunities like this, we want to make sure that as parents, we're having the opportunity to engage in discussion about what does it mean for our children to be good digital citizens. And so we're looking forward to our director of technology, Mr. Voss, come with some other area leaders in that realm and share with us just what it means for us to be able to support our children as we think about their connection to the digital world and their learning modes that they're facing. But then the rest of our wellbeing forums this year are all going to be with Dr. Jeffries, who we'll introduce here in just a moment, and having the opportunity to just engage in these thoughtful conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's a couple of things that Dr. Jeffries and I have talked a lot about. I mean, just the sense that we want to sort of grasp this moment, this historic moment in time. We want to seize this moment and do something powerful with it as a school district that draws us together to help us in making sure that we're providing an environment where students have a sense of belonging. They feel like they're valued. They feel like their voice is heard. And we know that these conversations will be uncomfortable and that they'll be difficult at times, but we know that they're going to be powerful and what it means for us in the long run. So here's the list of the things that we'll be doing throughout the course of this year. And we're looking forward to those conversations in kind of a long journey kind of format. As opposed to a short distance race, we're looking towards this long journey of just this conversation together. I thought I'd take just a minute too to sort of describe tonight's format. So you may see that there's some people on your screen. We've invited some representation from each of our buildings to come and be a voice in a live setting with Dr. Jeffries, where they can interact with him after he's finished with his presentation and discussion and dialogue. And so you'll see really a couple of representatives from each of our buildings on the screen tonight. But then we also want to give you that opportunity as well. We want you to have the opportunity to ask questions and to engage in discussion. But knowing that we were expecting sort of large numbers at this meeting tonight, we're asking you, if you have questions while you're listening to Dr. Jeffries tonight, we'd ask you to email Patrick Galloway at galloway.1@naples.us. So thank you, Patrick, for your willingness to set up this evening's Zoom's meeting and to host and sort of manage the questions that'll be coming in there. And so when Dr. Jeffries finishes, we'll open up to discussion. We'll probably start with the people that are kind of live in that session and have an opportunity for them to begin that dialogue. But then Patrick will moderate those questions that come in from you that are watching from YouTube. So we're looking forward to your input as well this evening and invite you to do that. I want to take a moment now just to read for you a short description of Dr. Jeffries and to help you get to know him a little bit better maybe before he comes to speak with you this evening. I've had the great opportunity to speak with him a number of times on the phone and feel like I'm in relationship there. But I want to share with you that Dr. Jeffries is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University, where he teaches graduate and undergraduate seminars on civil rights and Black Power movement and surveys in African American and American history. He's a very popular professor at Ohio State, a popular speaker and consultant. He's working with several area school districts and other organizations in the Columbus area. He's an author and a sought after guest in a variety of venues. As an example, tonight even, he's actually presenting tonight from New York because he's been asked to come out there to be a part of a documentary there as well that I'm sure he'll probably share with you. But another example of his work, though, is with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching and Tolerance Project, and specifically a podcast called Teaching Hard History, where he engages listeners in what he describes as history that is hard to think about, hard to talk about, hard to teach about, and hard to learn about. We're excited to have him here tonight to lead us in a discussion that he's titled, How Did We Get Here? Basic Principles of Racial Equity. Dr. Jeffries, we welcome you to the New Albany Plain Local Schools Community Wellbeing Forum, and we look forward to our time together tonight. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Dr. Jeffries, you can jump on and take over.
Well, John, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Thank you for the invitation to partner with New Albany Plain Local Schools. I'm really excited about walking this journey together, this journey of learning, this journey of difference making and change making, especially at this current moment. Usually or too often when I'm invited to give a talk or presentation or do a little bit of work, you get one 90-minute segment and you got to cram everything in there and that's it. And you got to walk away and say, oh, I hope something stuck. I'm really looking forward to this opportunity of being able to spend this academic year together, if you will, sharing thoughts and ideas so we don't have to cram everything into one segment. We can really sort of spread these things out and build on what we discuss, what we talk about, what we think about, what we share over the course of the academic year. And so with that in mind, knowing that that was the case, as I began to think about what that great opportunity would look like, John and I in conversation together, we said, what we really need is to be able to lay some foundation, if you will, to establish some common language, some common understanding, so that we can kind of disabuse ourselves of some of the myths and misconceptions that are connected to the work of creating racial equity. And so that's what I've really structured this evening's conversation around these basic principles, basic ideas, basic concepts that we all should really have a good understanding of, so that when we begin the work of dismantling inequity and continue the work of building an equitable society, we kind of know where we're starting from so that we can have a good sense of where we want to go. Now, I'm going to share my screen in a second, but right before I do, I just want to explain one thing about this particular presentation. I'm going to do something that I never do ever, that I beat up my students for doing when I have them do presentations. This presentation will have a fair bit of words, if you will, on the screen. And that isn't because I like having words on the screen. That's because this is about terminology. This is about definition. So if I beg a little grace, if you will, this time around, and I promise this will be the only time I do it. We'll have lots of images and people dancing on the screen after this. But this time, I just implore you to hang with me, because it is really important that we get a clear sense of what it is that we're talking about when we are talking about racial equity work. And so with that, I will share my screen now, and then we can dive on in. So as John pointed out, the title for this particular presentation, this talk is How Did We Get Here? Basic Principles of Racial Equity. And I want to begin by first sort of speaking to the question of where is here? When we say, how do we get here? What exactly are we talking about? Where is here? And of course, I'm not talking about simple geography of New Albany, Central Ohio, or New York City. The here that we are talking about is a world in which racial inequity actually exists. This is the here. And by racial inequity, what I mean is when two or more racial groups are not standing on approximately equal footing. What does that mean? We can think about it. Here's a graphic that many have seen before, that many educators, many racial equity educators, many anti-racist educators will use variations of this. And I think it is really helpful. And we'll circle back to this at the end, because as you can see on the left hand is this question of equality. When the building blocks, the opportunities, the structures for one to succeed are even, without necessarily taking into consideration the needs of individual people, you can claim equality but still have inequity. In this instance, if the object is to be able to see the game, simply providing everyone with an equal footing, the same number of resources, without taking into consideration what each person actually needs, you can have equality without equity. And the image to the right shows this, what equity might look like, creating the building blocks for each person, each group, to have what they need in order to succeed, in order to see, if you will, in this example, but to succeed as a whole. So we have to be clear about sort of equality versus equity. And what does inequity, because we'll circle by the end of this evening, I want us to have a common understanding of sort of what our goals and objectives are when you're talking about doing racial equity work. But what does inequity look like in this place we call here, right? Where is here? The inequity that exists. Well, I think some good examples, and perhaps the most significant example for us is us being the sort of American society, is home ownership. Home ownership in 21st century America is truly the key to creating an equitable society. Home ownership, where one lives, but also one's ability to own where one lives, is really the key to an equitable society. Why is that? Because home ownership in American society really is the stepping stone to the middle class. It's how most Americans are able to build wealth. It's also how most Americans access opportunity where they live. So for two reasons, when we think about inequity, when you look at home ownership, when you look at where people live, we see inequity manifest. So we still live, despite the promises of creating desegregating America and open, fair housing and open housing and the like, we still live in a rigidly segregated society that then impacts a number of things, including our schools. It is not an accident that the racial demographic of New Albany, Plain Local Schools, is what it is, that it is over 80% white. Why? And not unlike many of its sister suburbs surrounding the central Ohio, Columbus. That is very much a function of where people have been allowed over the years, certainly over the last century, 90 years or so, where they have been allowed to purchase homes and live, that then creates access to the schools in which our children go to. This is also connected to wealth. The average, the median white household in America is worth about $140,000. Median Black household wealth is about $4,000. That's all connected, for the most part, to home ownership, where people live, because people's housing, their homes, the homes that they own, are their primary asset. In many instances, their sole asset. And so when we talk about inequity, we see it in home ownership, right? Far a greater percentage of white families own their own homes than a percentage of African American families, than a percentage of families of color. That is inequity. But that also has this rippling effect, because if you don't own your own home, therefore you're unable to develop the kind of wealth that you would need to move into neighborhoods that have access to opportunity. So where you live says so much about the opportunities that you can have in all these aspects of life, the kinds of schools you go to, the degree to which you can live in a safe environment, access to healthcare, proximity to jobs, And so inequity is very much playing out before our very eyes, and it is all connected. It's just not that our schools are look a particular way. It's that our schools look a particular way because our neighborhoods look a particular way, and our neighborhoods look a particular way because we have structured home ownership and home buying and home loans in particular ways to favor particular groups and to disadvantage certain groups. And even if we stop that today, we would still see this inequity because it has been built in, and I'll say a little bit more about this going in a second, has been built into the way we do things, even when we don't necessarily intentionally try to replicate inequity. So what are some key terms? If we're dealing with a society, both local, state, national, in which racial inequity exists, differences in the opportunities, differences in what people have based solely on their racial group, then how do we begin to make sense of this? What are some key terms that can help us understand this and engage in a thoughtful conversation as we move across this series of presentations? Well, the first one, and I'll break this down so you don't have to jot this down. This will be available, and you can go on YouTube and pause it, right? Just make sure you get me looking pretty at the time. You can pause it and you can jot down these terms, and so these will be available. But racism, and this is important to understand. And before I get into the definition, because we still have plenty of folk, and polls tell us this, that racism just doesn't exist. And that's ridiculous. You have to grant me this as a starting point, that racism is real and that racism still exists in this society. So what is racism? Racism involves, and I'm going to read this, but I'm going to pause at certain points. Racism involves one group having the power, and this is critical, power. So this moves it beyond the realm of just prejudicial beliefs. When you're moving it beyond the realm of prejudicial beliefs, because anybody can have prejudicial beliefs, that is a human trait, that is a human phenomenon. But not everybody in a society has the power to act on those prejudicial beliefs. So power becomes a critical component of understanding racism. So racism involves one group having the power to carry out, now the power, what is the power to do? The power to carry out systematic discrimination. So again, this isn't just about personal prejudice and somebody acting on their individual bias. This is about bias being embedded in the systems of society. So systematic discrimination through institutional policies and practices of the society. Institutional is key because this isn't just about sort of bad actors. This isn't just about somebody who harbors racist views, anti-Black views, anti-Latino views, or the like, anti-discriminatory views. This is about systematic discrimination that manifests itself in institutional policies and practices. How do our policies regarding home ownership, regarding who can get a loan, who can't get a loan, how does that impact home ownership? Those are the institutional policies and practices of the society. That's a key component of it. What do institutions beyond individuals actually, how do they perpetuate inequality? And the and part is critical. And by shaping the cultural beliefs and values that support those racist policies and practices. So racism isn't just the act itself. Racism in American society is very much embedded in our cultural beliefs and values, and it shapes the way in which we interact with people, right? So it provides and the culture is critically important because the culture provides the justification for the policies and the practices. And so it's not just a function of, oh, it's really unfortunate that people would harbor racist beliefs, that people would believe in white supremacy, for example. It's not just unfortunate that they believe that, it's that that belief then becomes a belief that justifies a particular set of actions that discriminate and cause harm to other people. So to just sum up, racism is about the power to act on prejudicial beliefs, to carry out those beliefs in systematic ways, to discriminate systematically, not just about individuals, that's connected to the ways in which institutions engage and uphold and create policies, and the practices that are connected to those policies. And then the culture that adopts these racist views, then those views will then serve, or those cultural beliefs and values then provide a justification for the racist policies and practices. I know that that is a lot, but how does this play out, right? We can look at it through historical examples. If turn of the century, one of early 1900s, between 1880 and 1930 or so, was the height of lynching in America. Public murders in which African Americans, people of color mostly, overwhelmingly men, but women were involved, also children, are publicly murdered to send a message to the broader Black community about transgressions when it comes to challenging white supremacy. So, but what was the justification? Very often, the justification was that African Americans, one, you didn't need a justification, you could just do it without cause or consequence. But very often the justification was that African Americans, particularly Black men, were preying on white women, that they were doing harm, doing violence to white women. He said, well, even when there was no evidence of it. And that is where the cultural beliefs come into play, because African Americans had been framed as being criminal, and African American men in particular had been disparaged as being sexual predators. That goes back to the era of slavery. And so these myths, these racist myths, then serve as a justification as well as a rationalization for these heinous acts. And that's why they become so dangerous and so problematic. Now, one of the things in the contemporary context that we have to be clear about too is when we talk about Black Lives Matter, the slogan for the longest time. And hold off, I'll explain sort of what Black Lives Matter in particular is. We have to, it's important to know that the struggle for basic civil rights and human rights that African Americans have been engaged in for the last 401 years, since 1619, since the moment they arrived on these shores, has been called many different things. But there have been core commonalities throughout. And African Americans for the last 401 years have been striving to obtain basic civil rights and fundamental human rights. Now, that effort, that struggle, has been called many different things. Some folk have, at one point it's just abolition, the effort to end slavery in America and to extend basic civil rights and human rights to African Americans. After slavery, it literally becomes a freedom struggle. African Americans, for the most part, are talking about the language of freedom. Give us freedom, broadly conceived, connected to civil rights and human rights. When we get into the 1950s, and they're still fighting for the same stuff, when we get into the 1950s, because it's the Cold War, the language of freedom becomes highly charged. It was already bad enough that you're asking for freedom, but those who were in opposition to extending civil rights and human rights to African Americans, they said, oh, they're talking about freedom. If they're talking about freedom, this must be associated with some communist effort. And so we see a shift in the language because of the Red Scare, because of anti-communism. We see a shift in the language away from freedom to civil rights. Well, if you're opposed to freedom, the NAACP would say, and Martin Luther King would say, you certainly can't be opposed to civil rights. I mean, we got a Bill of Civil Liberties. This is an extension of the same. So we see a language shift. And then when we get to the late 1950s, we see a shift away from civil rights to Black power. The same thing. All is the same in more strident tones and terms. African Americans demanding the ability to make the decisions that impact their lives, and with a heavy emphasis in particular on gaining political power, the power to impact their lives, the power to shape their own destiny, self-determination. So it becomes a Black power movement, but it's still under the umbrella of the Black freedom struggle. The same folk who are engaged in civil rights are the same folk who are engaged in Black power. And then fast forward to the early 20 teens, we see bubbling to the surface new language to speak to the same ideas. And this new language becomes Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter, and here's the definition broadly, a political movement to address systemic and state violence against African Americans. Now, Black Lives Matter in particular begins to mobilize as a political movement, as a political set of ideas, because Black Lives Matter is really an idea more so than an organization. There are Black Lives Matter organizations that emerge in 2013, 2014, and that will be sprinkled out across the country, but it's decentralized. There's no one central organization, but all feel connected to this idea, to this umbrella idea of Black humanity and wanting to bring an end to violence against African Americans, emanating specifically from the state, by extension, and police being an extension of the state. That is the particular focus of Black Lives Matter, and that shouldn't be. And as we think about it, that shouldn't be something that is partisan. It is literally a call, an extension of this longer struggle to secure basic civil rights and human rights, with a particular emphasis on ending state violence. And you say, well, how important is that, right? Well, I mentioned earlier this era of lynching, public murders. Well, during the height of the lynching era, there were, on average, for a number of years there, about 110, 120 African Americans to a week who were publicly murdered somewhere in the United States. Mostly in the South, but in Ohio, and that's not including sort of racial massacres that would occur, or in Indiana, and racial massacres that would occur in cities and states like East St. Louis in Missouri and Springfield in Illinois, as well as in Ohio. Well, when we think about violence emanating from the state, we know that for the last 10 years, the best statistics that are available tell us that on average over those last 10 years, police or African Americans are dying at the hands of police. They have been dying at a rate of about 350 a year. That means for the last decade, 3 times as many African Americans have died at the hands of police than have died at the hands of lynch mobs during the era of lynching. That's just the facts. And that notion, that reality, right, where it's not just about numbers, it's about the possibility of what might befall somebody if they find themselves in the wrong situation for no fault of their own, is what really sparked this movement, what really sparked this political effort. And again, this is, yes, it's a critique of the way in which the state operates, but really it is just a call for the recognition of Black humanity, for people who are African American to be able to live in this society without fear from those who they expect safety and protection from. So what have been some of the impediments to achieving racial equity? What have been some of the impediments to creating safety, if you will, for African Americans, and not just safety from excessive violence from police, not just safety from vigilante violence, but safety from poverty, right? I mean, that does a different kind of violence, but it's a kind of violence that we know disproportionately impacts African Americans. So when thinking about some of these impediments, what are we talking about? And again, this is all about key terms and language that we'll hear being discussed. We really have to make sure we have our minds wrapped around. So the first impediment, we talked about racism, but really is more specifically and concrete is this notion of white supremacy. And we often, in this day and age, we often associate white supremacy with extremist groups. And yes, they rally around the term of white supremacy, whether they're tiki torch bearing folk in neo-Nazis in Charlottesville in 2017, or they are online. They rally around this term white supremacy, but it's not something white supremacy, when we talk about white supremacy, this is something that is just limited to them. White supremacy is really something that is pervasive. It's an idea, an ideology that white people, here we are, that white people and the ideas, thoughts, and beliefs and actions of white people are somehow superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. Now, look, this is not something new. This is something, white supremacy is something that we have been dealing with as a nation, that we have accepted from the founding through the turn of the century, through the current moment, in different ways as being totally acceptable. When we go back and look at the ways in which, or the language of the founders, this isn't of the nation. This nation, yes, Jefferson is talking about all men are created equal, but that's only because he did not need to qualify what he was talking about in the moment. He was under no illusions when talking about all men are created equal, that he was including African Americans in that he was including people of African descent, that he was including Native Americans in that. There was this belief that the ideas and thoughts, beliefs and actions of African Americans were somehow inherently inferior because they were people of African descent compared to people of European descent. And this is important again, because this provides, this cultural belief, this ideology provides the justification for the actions. This is something that is absolutely born during the era of slavery and looks unique in the American context, although it really is a global phenomenon, sort of a new world phenomenon. But when emancipation ends, when slavery finally ends, white supremacy, this belief system, this ideology that had served as the justification for slavery itself, whether that took the form of cultural absurdities or religious absurdities, curse of Ham, whatever it was, it boiled down to this belief in white supremacy. We ended slavery. Yes, we should applaud. We should pat ourselves on the back as a nation for ending slavery. But what we didn't end, we did not end white supremacy. The principal legacy of the institution of slavery is the justification for that institution, which was a belief in white supremacy. And that wasn't something that was just confined to the states of the South. White supremacy was an ideology that was nationwide. Even abolitionists, even good folk here in Ohio that came into the Union opposed to the institution of slavery, but they were on the right side of history, but for the wrong reasons. They opposed slavery because they didn't want black folk coming into the Union, coming into Ohio in 1803. So even abolitionists believed down the road. Even abolitionists believed in white supremacy. You could be an abolitionist and still believe in white supremacy. You could be opposed to slavery and still believe in white supremacy. You could be opposed to Jim Crow and still believe in white supremacy. You could be opposed to segregated schools down south and still believe in white supremacy in Ohio. And so it's important that we understand that this manifests itself in different ways, but that it is still present with us today. It's also important to note that white supremacy specifically as a specific form of racism, right? The connecting these prejudicial beliefs tied to race and having the power to act on it is the most powerful political organizing tool that this nation has ever created. White supremacy, specific form of racism, is the most powerful political organizing tool that this nation has ever created. It has the ability to mobilize millions. And we have seen that in the history of the United States. So white supremacy is one of these impediments, the persistence of this belief. And it is, both expressed consciously and unconsciously, right? And so we will hear conversation about implicit bias. That is the subconscious ways in which we express prejudicial beliefs. Now, some people will say, and I get this, I hear this a lot in terms of a critique and pushback. Well, Dr. Jeffries, are you saying that everybody or all white people are racist in American society? I was like, no, I didn't say that. You just said that. I didn't say that. I said, what I'm saying is that it is impossible to escape the influence of racism in American society. Now, how do I know this? There are a number of implicit bias tests that anyone can take. And you could, Harvard has a number of them, and they're quite simple, right? Several of them will look at, and I encourage everyone you get a chance to take them because they are very revealing. They will look at, for example, they will flash images on the screen, and you will see various people, white people, black people, men, women, old, young, Latino, Asian, and you have to identify, you're sort of a police officer, if you will, and you have to identify the threat, right? And as soon as the image shows, is it a person holding a cell phone or is it a person holding a gun? And the person holding the gun, you have to identify as the threat. And you just hit a little tab, you hit the right arrow if it's a threat, and you hit the left arrow if it's a non-threatening person. And so I take these tests. I've taken these tests more than I care to admit. And I remember the first time, I took the test and I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'm gonna do good on this, right? Surely I'm gonna be able to identify threats, especially when they're black. And then, what happens? That subconscious kicks in. Why? Because I grew up here in America. I'm just like everybody else. And so when suddenly they start flashing, brothers, with cell phones, and I'm hitting the key, I'm like, oh my God, just shot another brother, right? And they're like, oh my goodness, and this person looks like just like me. So what's happening there? Now, in my defense, my rate of doing harm to black people on average was a lot lower than the rate of the average white person doing the same test. But I wasn't immune to it. And that's the point, that it impacts us all. We just have to develop the self-awareness. And so, yeah, my rate was lower, right? I'm partly born of experience and partly because I'm constantly thinking about these things. But when you look at the metadata, it becomes clear that, yeah, black folk are on the scale too. Latinos are on the scale too. And white folk are just a little higher. So the point is, we cannot escape it in this society, because we are constantly being bombarded, even the most well-meaning of us. We can't escape it because we're constantly being bombarded with these negative stereotypes about race, these negative stereotypes about people of color, because we still are privileging and prioritizing the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white folk over people of color. So white supremacy is very real, and it touches all of us. We have to do the work to unravel that in our own minds. And so that's the implicit bias that even the best of us have to deal with. White privilege. Now look, white folk on here, don't start getting nervous. All right, we're gonna talk about white privilege. It's okay. It's okay. White privilege defined: the unquestioned and unearned. Now this is critical. Two parts to that. Unquestioned, i.e., the person who benefits from the white privilege is like, oh, this is just something I gained, right? Like not questioning how this advantage came about. Unquestioned and unearned, i.e., you didn't do anything necessarily to get it, but the advantage is accruing to you. Set of advantages, entitlements, benefits, and choices bestowed on people solely because they are white, solely because of race. Now, what is white privilege? What are we talking about here? And the immediate pushback that I get from white privilege is, I'll do a presentation, and it could be, in Ohio and, southeastern Ohio, and, very well-meaning white person in the back will raise their hand and be like, yo, Dr. Jeffries, You know, I understand what you're saying about white privilege, about individuals benefiting in the society, gaining certain advantages solely because of their race, solely because they're white. But let me tell you that my grandparents were coal miners, and my parents grew up in a trailer, and they didn't have. They were so poor they couldn't even drink water. They just had to drink oil. I mean, just mobile home, just so poor. Like, how on earth could I be a beneficiary of white privilege? I'm insulted by that. And I was like, look, it is called white privilege. It is not called white guarantee. You are not guaranteed to be wealthy because you are white in American society. It's just the opposite. You're probably going to be catching some hell too. It's not called white guarantee. The privilege is that you have the privilege of not having to deal with many of the obstacles and impediments that African Americans and people of color have to deal with solely because of their race. And so when we think about segregated schools, for example, and home ownership, for example, and if you have the means to gain access to a home loan, the privilege is being able to get the home loan and not being denied it solely because you are an African American. It wasn't, the government didn't say that because you're white, you're guaranteed to have a loan. The government said in 1930s, the homeowners loan corporation and redlining and all this, they said, if you're white, you have the chance to get it. You have the opportunity if you can figure out how to get the money. Not a guarantee, but the privilege. Black folk and people of color are denied that opportunity. They do not benefit from that privilege. So, and that will manifest itself in many different ways, right? That's the systematic way when we're thinking about home ownership and housing, but also the privilege of being able to walk through society, right? Being able to interact with police without fear of your own personal safety. Like, that becomes a privilege that is bestowed upon certain people solely because of their skin color. Why? Because they are not perceived as a threat in the same way that people of color will be perceived as a threat, speaking in general terms, that can then lead to deadly and dangerous consequences. So we have to acknowledge that privilege based on race exists. It is out there, and people will benefit from it in different ways. Now, that does not mean that there are not Black folk who have succeeded in this society. Of course there are. Oprah has a lot of money. I get it, right? Like, we get that. You know, LeBron James is successful. We get that. There is the possibility of success in American society, but the success of people of color does not erase the fact that white skin privilege actually exists. It just means that these Black folk had to do it despite that. They had to overcome various obstacles despite that. So the two don't cancel each other out. And so that defensiveness, when talking about white privilege, that might well up, you know, sort of under the skin and under the emotions, like, wait a minute, I'm still not sure Dr. Jeffries was going on, is also one of the impediments. And that's white fragility, right? It's this notion that, oh my goodness, you know, you sort of get on the defensive. And I'm just going to sum this up. There's too many words on here, but I'm just going to sum it up, right? It's this state, right, where, and Robin DiAngelo, whose book, White Fragility, you know, many of you might be familiar with, but essentially he's saying, when you talk about issues connected to race, when you talk about racism, when you talk about the possibility of privilege and some people benefiting because of their skin color, and some people at a disadvantage because of their skin color, the white fragility, the defensiveness of white folk come into play, right? And that is like, hey, you know, white privilege exists. Well, are you saying I'm racist? Where did that come from? Nobody's talking about you, right? Like, we're talking about these broader impact of the larger society. So just relax, right? And that's the fragility of the defensiveness is one of these examples. Now, we see it, you know, in the era of social media and film and posts and cell phone cameras. We see this white fragility always popping up, right? In these various memes and various incidents of people, coming up on, to Black folk and assuming that they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And then when you call them out on it, they get all emotional. Like, what are you getting emotional for? I'm the one whose life you just put in jeopardy by calling the police because I'm trying to have a barbecue. I almost cussed, John, but I held myself back. That is the white fragility that we're talking about. It's this assumption that the critique of society is somehow an indictment of you yourself. And sometimes we just got to get out of our own way, right? In many different instances, but certainly when we're trying to deal with racial equity and we're trying to deal with the legacy of white supremacy and the ways in which it continues to impact our society today. It ain't about you. It's about fixing what we have gotten wrong in this society. So sometimes we just got to relax, just chill, just take a step back and say, all right, it exists. Now, how can we work to get rid of it, right? How can we work to get rid of these problems? Now, this last section, and then we'll open it up. I hope you've been emailing Patrick at Galloway.1. I did that like an advertisement. Galloway.1. Hit him up, and so we'll get those questions. We'll get those questions going. So, what's the purpose of all this, right? The purpose ain't just to beat up on white folk. The purpose ain't to make anybody feel bad, right? The purpose isn't to make certain people feel good at the distress of others, right? What are the goals and objectives? The goals and objectives are to create a society in which everybody has the opportunity to thrive, in which everyone understands the circumstances and conditions that make it harder for others to achieve, and that might make it a little bit easier for some to achieve, right? And when we're talking about the context of education, we're talking about the context of schools. This is so important for our children to understand, for our children to accept sort of the advantages and the privileges that they have. And the privileges aren't solely connected to race. I mean, that's just one aspect, right? I'm a professor at The Ohio State University. My wife is in med school, right? She's about to finish up and be a doctor, and we have 3 beautiful African-American daughters. They are going to have certain privileges in their life based solely on the professional success of their parents. I get that. They need to understand that. They need not be walking around this society acting like, oh, how come everybody can't do what you did, what I did? Well, not everybody has 2 parents in those positions. Not everybody has had grandparents who were professionals with master's degrees and the like as social work. I mean, so not everybody has those same advantages. And our children need to understand that everybody has to work hard, but not everybody has the same set of challenges. And therefore, not everyone has the same set of choices for which they have to make decisions that will impact their lives. So what are these goals and objectives? I think on an individual level, thinking about these basic principles of racial equity, I think we all need to be, and this is everybody, again, because white supremacy is something that impacts the lives of everybody, will touch everybody on the inside and the out. The first thing is we have to be anti-racist. Ibram Kendi, a friend of mine who was just in New Albany, has written this powerful, a series of powerful books about how to be anti-racist, but also stamped from the beginning. And he makes the compelling argument that this is, if there's anything that's a binary, and he does good work talking about false binaries, but he was like, look, you either are anti-racist, working actively in support of anti-racist policies, or you're racist and you're working to uphold them. Like silence and inaction, according to Ibram Kendi, is, and I think he's right, is actual complicity. It is not enough to say, I'm opposed to racism. You have to actively engage in activities that will help end the ways in which racism impacts and influences and informs our society. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean to be anti-racist, you have to join a protest in the street and try to change? No, it doesn't mean that. Everybody can express their anti-racist beliefs and actions in different ways. And we all have spheres of influence. And so what we're saying by those who are calling for people to be anti-racist is say within your sphere of influence, reject and actively work against not only individuals who express racist beliefs, but also the institutions in which we live working against policies and practices that will lead to disparate racial outcomes. That's what we can do. And I think on a practical level, that's what it means to be anti-racist, to identify and then to act. This is also not something that you wake up one day and say, hey, I'm anti-racist, I'm good, right? Let's get to work. It is a learning process, right? All of this is process. We have as much unlearning to do as we have learning to do. Like, we can talk about these terms, but we have to do a lot of unlearning. We have to see the world differently, see the way in which it is structured and ways in which it operates differently, the way in which it creates different choices for different people. That's the learning and unlearning, because we tend to default back to, inequality being a function of poor decision making in American society. Racial inequality is a function of Black people making bad choices in their life. Like, that's how we assume inequality has come about. We may acknowledge that racial disparities exist, but it's because, Black folk have been making poor decisions about where to live, or their health outcomes are simply a function of them making poor dietary choices, not acknowledging, for example, that where people live influences and impacts their access to quality food and the kinds of food they have. We have these things, one of the terms that we often will talk about in racial equity work is food deserts, whole communities in which the only food that folk have access to, and we know in low income communities with high percentages of African Americans, you can't get fresh produce. You're limited to these corner stores with older produce and then processed foods. And then you wonder why, not just in Columbus, Ohio, but in Atlanta, Georgia, and in the Delta of Mississippi, you wonder why Black folk are suffering from COVID-19 at higher rates because they have diabetes. There's a higher rate of diabetes. Well, why do Black folk have diabetes? Just because they like drinking Kool-Aid? No, because they don't have access to the same degree of healthy food, right? Poor folk, we know, have different diets that are high in sodium and high in processed food. So sort of part of being sort of anti-racist is saying, wait a minute, let me understand the world through a different frame so I can make sense of these disparate impacts and not just reduce them to decision-making on the part of African Americans or poor folk. Everybody has choices. So this isn't absolving anybody of choices. Everybody has choices to make in this world, but not everybody has the same set of choices. And so we have to understand the sets of choices that people have and what are the factors that limit their choices. So one example, I talk to my students all the time, and I say, you look at going into college, right? And college enrollment. You say, well, how come more black students don't go to college? And a lot of white kids, coming from New Albany plain local schools, right, where you have this high rate of almost everybody goes to college, right? They're like, well, I don't know. Well, how come they weren't talking to the counselors, about going to school? Well, there's a different set of choices. Right. For many people of color, for many people as a whole, we know college isn't an option for a number of different reasons, not only income, not only ability to pay, but also preparation. And so it's not just simply a matter of, when thinking about sort of these outcomes, in this instance, going to college, it's not simply a matter of personal choice. It's a matter of choosing, or what choices people are making within the set of choices that they have, that are usually created by factors that are beyond their control. And so the ultimate goal, I think, on an individual level is sort of becoming anti-racist, actively working against manifestations of racism in our spaces and spheres of influence. But more broadly, beyond the individual, is seeking racial justice, is bringing about racial justice. And I promise you, this is the last These are the last words that you will see this evening. Racial justice, the systematic fair treatment, right? So fair treatment, and this next part is really important. The systematic fair treatment. So I'm not just going to treat an individual fairly, right? I'm going to treat the whole group fairly, regardless of whether or not I know this person or not, because we're at the moment in American society where we're real good about creating exceptions. I will treat this black person, this person of color who I know very well, or I can admire this black person or person of color who is beamed into my living room 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because they are a political figure, or because they're an entertainer, or because they're an athlete, and I feel that I know them. This is about treating people, all people, regardless of our personal relationship with them, people of all races, fairly. And when thinking about racial justice too, this isn't just about sort of treating black folk differently. This is about treating all people the same. So racial justice is inclusive. It is not exclusive. This is not about favoritism. This is not about treating black folks somehow special when all things are equitable. This is about doing what's necessary to get people to an equitable position, and so that all people can have the same opportunities, which hopefully will lead to very similar outcomes. So yes, this is about outcome creation, but outcome creation based upon creating opportunities for everybody. So racial justice, the systematic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes. So this is both, right? If we do the work to eliminate racial injustice, then we should see the same kinds of outcomes when we provide people with the same kinds of opportunities. We started with a graphic that was sort of comparing equity and equality, and that equality was providing everybody with those same benches, the same sort of opportunities, if you will. Equality, equity, sort of addressing the particular needs of all the groups. So that means if somebody needs a little bit more to see over that fence, then by all means, we'll provide them with a little bit more. The support that everybody needs, everybody gets. That's equity. But justice is taking that a bit further. Get rid of the darn fence so that it's not about providing needs to see over it, the obstacle in front of them. It's about removing the obstacle in the first place. And that benefits everyone. And that's what we want in the end, because we don't want to have to keep providing additional needs and support for folk when what we could do is just get the obstacle out of the place, out from in front of them in the first place. And then everybody benefits from it. The reason why, and this last word, and then we'll open it up. The reason why we want racial equity in a society is because, or equity in general, racial equity in this particular instance, is because everybody has something to contribute. Everybody has something to contribute. And the only way you don't believe that is if you, particularly when it comes to race, is if you believe in racism, right? That people of different races, people who aren't white, have something to contribute to society. Everybody has human potential, and we just have to tap into that potential. And that's not only great for those folk, that is great for society as a whole. Everybody benefits when everyone's human potential is tapped into. That's where we want. So in the end, the goal is not just to benefit a particular community. Everybody benefits from it. If we provide the opportunities for all people, to become scientists, if that is where their heart leads them, then society as a whole benefits from what they discover. That's what we need. That's what we want. That is the benefit of pursuing justice for all people, regardless of race. Well, thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen now, and I'll turn it back over to John.
Well, it must have been good because I saw Renee do the whoop whoop. I think so. Thank you for for being thoughtful about giving us kind of a basics kind of approach today. I think this is great for sort of setting us a framework for the work that comes ahead and the conversations that come ahead. Some of those terms are kind of difficult for me to grapple with, you know. So when I think about privilege, or when I think about maybe my own fragility can potentially slow the pace of where all this goes, you know, those are hard things to just sort of grapple with. And so just thanks for your willingness to present those in a way that we can embrace them and sort of think about them, and to be able to keep this journey moving forward. So I really appreciate that. And there's a couple of things for me that are just big takeaways, and I want to open it up. And so while I'm saying just a couple words here, the folks that are actually on the call, I'd like you to unmute and be ready to ask some questions here. And then Patrick can join in with questions that have come in from the folks on YouTube as well. And for those of you that maybe missed the beginning of the YouTube presentation part of it, Galloway.1, GALLAWA.1 @naples.us is an email spot where you could throw in a question while we're talking here over the next few minutes. But I think about this piece of like anti-racist being kind of a verb rather than a noun, you know, where it's got to have some kind of action that comes with it. That's a big takeaway for me tonight, that if I want to use that term connected to me, and I want to be able to own that as being something that as a characteristic of me, it requires some kind of action that goes with it. And so just really appreciate the way that you presented things tonight that gave us the opportunity to walk away with energy to continue the conversation. So with that, I got a number of things that I could ask here too, but I want to give you guys the opportunity. So for those of you that are actually live on the call tonight, let's take a chance now for you to ask a question or provide a comment, and we'll start from there. So I see the Minor family. Go ahead.
We both have separate questions, but I'm a Black kid in this neighborhood. I moved here in 8th grade, but almost every day I see multiple children that I know, younger, older than me, saying these hateful things on their social media or texting it to me and saying these racist, hateful things. And I hope that they don't mean it. And because the things that they're saying, no child comes up with that. They're getting it from somewhere, and they're not themselves. I don't think that they're racist. They're doing this because that's what their parents are saying. No one says these sentences. No one says Mexicans are rapists. No child just says that. They hear it. And every day I'm tackled with these people. And I know they don't mean it because the message always changes, but it's always a different type of racism. How do I say all this to say, how do I help them? Because you have been talking about how these people have these realizations that they're being racist, they have white supremacy, white fragility. How do I help them understand that they're not understanding what I've gone through? Because I've had dialogues with people where I explain to them that I fear things that they wouldn't even think twice about, especially in this neighborhood. I can't go outside at nighttime and just walk around my neighborhood with a hood on, but they could just go out at any time at night and just leave. And I think, because I've had these conversations and they seem to just not listen to it. So how do I help these people get to that place?
I'm glad we're starting off with easy questions from Mr. Thank you very much, Mr. Minor. You know, and it's first, I applaud you sharing, but then I applaud the sentiment, because the hardest thing to do, the easy thing to do, is just to walk away and be like, you know what, I don't want to deal with y'all. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to deal with y'all. But you are actually showing, exhibiting greater empathy for them and what would benefit them and what they need to move through this world than they are actually showing towards you and your experience. So, you know, to that, I salute you for that, because that is, and I hope you hold and cling to that, because that is not an easy burden to carry. And it's not an easy burden to carry because what you're asking is very difficult to do. We like to think, and this is coming, I say this as an educator, we like to think that truth is enough to move people away from their biases and their prejudices. That if I just share with you what is actually true, that you will then see the light. And we know, unfortunately, that is not the case. You are at the age right now that your peers are really, and you, I think you're absolutely right that this isn't stuff that they're coming up with, right? I mean, high schoolers, middle school, high school in that age, they're not just creating this stuff on they're echoing what they are hearing from their parents, from their community, online, social media, their inputs, right? There's lots of inputs coming from a lot of different directions. And we hear young people parroting those. What they're actually doing, because this is the age in which we see it, they're actually searching for confirmation of these beliefs. Right? Like it's still, so like all hope isn't lost, but this is the moment, not just for you, but really for all of us as a community and educators to intervene, to do the intervention work and say, wait a minute, I know what you're doing. You're floating this stuff out there because you're hearing it. It may not have been deeply embedded yet, but if people aren't shooting it down, if people aren't saying that's not right, if people are not pushing back on it, that in itself is confirmation. So it's not just about people saying, oh, yes, that's right, pat on the back, you go with white supremacy. It's that when people don't say anything at all, then that itself is confirmation. And so floating this stuff, partly it's sometimes, people just don't know any better, right? This is all they've heard and they're echoing it again. And so we have to do that work of intervening and pointing it out. But we can't get discouraged when just simply stating the truth. Look, my experience is different than yours. And they're like, I don't know what that means. Like, what are you talking about? We can't get discouraged because just simply sharing the truth isn't enough. Now, you situated yourself. I mean, you put a lot on your shoulders, right? I mean, I'm about to, bring you on as a consultant for me. This idea of what can we do? You can't do it all yourself, right? Like you can only do what you can do. You can only share your experiences. There may be some folk who, you know what, this relationship that I have with you and the things that you are sharing are toxic. Now, I've told you how I felt. I've asked you why. I think one of the most powerful questions or ways to confront somebody who is exhibiting racist behavior, saying racist things as young folk is, why did you say that? You don't have to carry the burden on your shoulders of trying to explain to them what's wrong with what they're saying. That's too much weight. You got homework to do, right? You just say to them, why did you say that? What did you mean by that, right? And let them do the work of crafting and thinking and reflecting on that, right? And that becomes your go-to response, right? You don't have to think of an explanation. Let them explain it, because I guarantee you, if you thought it was racist, it probably was, right? Let them do the work and let them live with it. And I guarantee you, not everybody, some kids will be like, what are you talking about? And they'll ignore it. But some, not all, but some will say, you know what? I thought about that. And I've been thinking about that for a while. Because there's stuff I know in the past that I've heard people say and I didn't respond to in the moment. I carried that with me for years, saying, how should I have responded to that? So the simple question of, why did you say that? What did you mean by that? And then let them do the work, especially for those who, you care about, their friends. You want to hang out. It's cool, right? We love playing hoops, but you say some crazy stuff, right? Like, why are you saying that? And if it becomes too much, then you gotta walk away. Like, I don't need that. Right? Not everybody who's in our life, deserves to be there, right? Like, that's a privilege. Like, being a friend, especially in a society that is so disparaging against people of color and young brothers, especially, like somebody being your friend, that's a privilege for them, right? And it's not something you don't owe your friendship to anybody, right? Like they deserve to have you in their life, but if they don't value you by making you an exception or not taking serious your experiences, that's all right. I'll go play hoops with Dr. Jeffries down in Columbus, right? Come on down to Ohio State. We'll go to the gym. We'll hang out.
Right. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Renee, I think I saw that you had a question in the chat box. Did you want to ask something tonight?
I did. I was curious, Dr. Hassan. Thank you. First off, I am first generation Latina, and I've actually never heard anybody say, let them do the work. That statement of empowerment, that never even occurred to me that could actually be a position that I could take. I always felt like I had to justify my humanity, my very nature of being here, particularly as an immigrant, and my language. So that actually has me reeling and a little bit emotional. But when you were talking about white fragility, it struck me that in so many of these recent cases that we've seen, the Central Park murder, other things that have gone on, you talked about sort of the rage that these people feel when questioned. And I actually felt like I've wondered if the rage also came from actually white supremacy itself, the entitlement. How dare you ask me why I'm asking you what you're doing here? I'm entitled to ask you by the very nature of me being superior to you. And that didn't seem to be addressed.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the ways these deeply rooted beliefs in white supremacy will manifest themselves. And again, I don't think, from what we could see, many of these incidents, as you mentioned in Central Park, I mean, these are well-meaning, these are very nice white people, right? By all other measures, they seem to be very nice white people that have this moment. In other words, they're not card-carrying members of the Klan or some racial terrorist group, right? And so we say, well, what's going on there? It is that sense of entitlement to space. Now, that sense, as you framed it very nicely, that sense of entitlement isn't just I belong here or I can do this. It's also you don't belong here, right? Like that is so critical to understanding that sense of privilege, right? Like, what are you doing, black man, telling me I can't walk my dog, in the bramble? Like, how dare you? In fact, I now feel threatened. What are you talking, lady? Get your dog out the bushes. Like, it's not that complicated. But what is this sense of entitlement that you can't, like, what you shouldn't even be in this space, right? Like, black folk having a barbecue, out in Oakland, California, in the park. It's a public park. What are you talking about? And this question of, I don't think you belong, right? So that sense of belonging is a reflection of this privilege, yes, but it's rooted in these deep-seated beliefs in white supremacy. And this is just how they manifest. And again, those become, Renee, like these personal manifestations, but they can become very dangerous, right? Not just in that moment because they may call the police and lead to an encounter, but what are the decisions that that folk are making, right? In corporate America, right? Like that's where, and we don't see it, right? Because we don't see the confrontation. They just may see the name Malik on a job application, right? Or Rodriguez on a job application, something they think they identify with a particular ethnicity or race. And they're like, no, I'm not gonna go in that direction, right? Why? Because I don't think they belong in this space. Like, so that's that privilege also can, that sense of entitlement to space, who belongs as a gatekeeper, can have real world effects on people of color, on African Americans. So yeah, I think the two are absolutely linked and connected.
Thank you. Mr. Valentine, I think you had a question you wanted to ask as well.
I do, thank you. Dr. Jeffries, always enjoy listening to you. I've heard you a few times. My question is sort of, it's about race, but I want to double click a little bit around like acquired diversity. So I do a lot of mentoring, and we're fortunate, we have our battles and issues in the New Albany School District, but granted, we're fortunate. There's with the acquired diversity, it seems that in regards to employment, secondary education, home ownership, which I think is huge. As they always said, Big Mama lived here, my mom and dad lived here, and that's where I'm going to live, and this is what I'm going to do. What ways, in addition to folks getting out of their comfort zone and doing a lot of mentoring programs, what way do we address the acquired diversity?
So let me ask you, just for clarity's sake, what do you mean specifically by sort of acquired diversity?
So acquired, that a lot of our youth today think that maybe that's all they know, so they want to stay in that comfort zone. So how do we really get them to see what other options and different things are out there to be able to explore, versus just be able to think that they're limited to what they currently have?
As children of color specifically.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, one of the things that's actually an important question. Getting young people and children of color to see a world of possibility while they live in a world that is denying them possibilities. Like that is not easy to do, right? Because it's not simply a function of, look, you can do anything. It's a function of seeing what is possible, right? And so you mentioned mentoring, that is critical, right? What we're talking about is how do you get children of color who are in positions or living in a world of limited possibility to think beyond the world in which they live. Like, that's called dreaming. And it's almost unfair to just say dream about possibilities if we are not doing the work to show them that these are not necessarily dreams, but these are actual possibilities. And so that means, not just sort of picking up one kid, bringing him out, to, a wealthy suburb saying, look at the world of possibilities, because all they do is see a bunch of white folk and be like, well, that don't seem very possible to me. Right. But it's bringing them back and saying, okay, this is the world. Now, what is it? I said, what it is. I'm only 2 days in Brooklyn. I'm already back talking about what it is. What is it that you want? Right. And then, like, what are your dreams, and thinking about sort of what is it that animates a child, a young person? And often they won't frame it necessarily in the things that we will see as professions, right? Like it may be a child who's like, I love training dogs, right? Just a kid in the city. I just love training dogs, right? Of being a veterinarian has never been a possibility to them. But what they're talking about is their love of animals. So how can we connect that child who just loves playing with animals and loves playing with dogs to a professional who says, you know what, this is what you can do with your passion? And so finding those links, because, taking that kid and then showing them, like, hey, I need you to hang out with these architects. They're gonna be like, well, what's the point of this, right? Like, that's not where my passion is, right? It's getting those personal relationships. I think mentoring is absolutely critical, especially on a one-on-one basis, if it's done to help children not just connect with an individual and children of color, but help children of color and those who don't have the same amount of opportunities as others to see a spectrum of possibility. And then it's also not enough just to leave it there, right? It's not enough to say, hey, look at all the possible things that you could be in this world, and then not actually provide them with some mechanisms to get there. Like that, to me, that's not helping somebody dream. That's creating a nightmare. Like, you done show me this world of possibilities, and now I have no way of actually making that dream come true. You were better off just leaving me hanging out here and not knowing that this thing was possible. And so I think it's about, it's connecting and showing possibility, but it's also about the action, as John was talking about, the action of actually deconstructing some of the obstacles that might be in their way. Because children who are denied opportunity intergenerationally are not going to see a world of possibility. That's just called survival. Why am I going to be thinking about all the things that I could be when I know that the odds of me actually being them is impossible because of the situations and circumstances I find myself? So I'm not going to deal with that. I'm going to deal with my reality in the moment. That's just survival. So what we have to do is make it possible so they can think beyond just survival and think about possibility and dreaming, right, going forward. And that is mentoring programs, but that's also thinking about how can school districts connect with each other, exchange programs, cultural exchange programs. We got to meet more than just on the gridiron, right? Like, we got to meet in the laboratory. We have to meet in the library. Like, those become critically important programs as well.
Thank you.
Dr. Jeffries, I want to throw in one from out on the YouTube channel part, and then we'll come back to folks that are here on this live part as well. So this is a question that came from the YouTube folks that I'm not sure we can really get into fully. The beginning of the question was asking about critical race theory. And I don't know that we have time tonight to sort of get in and define critical race theory, but this is the part of the question I thought was really important. Critical race theory, or if I think about your comments tonight about 1619 and the start of slavery and that hard history kind of piece that we intend to go to as we go throughout the course of this year. What would you respond to the person who says, is that working against America? Is that un-American in its nature?
Yeah.
Is it anti-patriotic to sort of walk that path? How would you respond to that question?
So, and of course, we saw in September, I mean, there's a context to this question, I'm sure. There has been so much discussion most recently from the current administration in August, September, about critical race theory being sort of unpatriotic and the like. First, just to define what critical race theory is. I mean, this isn't some radical, sort of way of seeing the world. It's just saying that when looking at American society in the past and the present, in order to understand sort of the life choices, life chances, life circumstances of people of color, of African Americans, but also the larger society, you have to consider the way in which race has impacted their lives, the way in which racism and racial discrimination has impacted their lives. Right? You can't look back at the institution of 250 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow, and then decades of mass incarceration and the like, and say, oh, race has no impact on their lives. So critical race theory is just simply, it's a fancy way of saying race matters in America, right? And race has always mattered in America. And so let's figure out how it matters so that we can make sense not only of the past, but so that we can also understand the present, so that we can create a more democratic and equitable future. So is that unpatriotic in some way to take a critical to do a critical analysis of the American past? No, I think it's the height of patriotism to take an honest look at ourselves, to take an honest look at American society, to figure out how we got there. Not because we want to be critical about the past, but because we want to make sense of the present, right? And we are deceiving ourselves if we don't look at this critical aspect of American society. This notion that racism is woven into our DNA from the very start. And we have to understand, ourselves as a nation. We got to figure out how this thing has been playing out. Like, that is not unpatriotic. That's not creating a generation of children who are going to hate America. That's creating a generation of children who are finally going to understand America and understand the situation and circumstance that they find themselves in today, no matter if they're Black, white, Latin, Asian, it doesn't matter. Why? Because they're not responsible for any of that stuff. They're not even responsible for the mess. Many of you have heard me say, they're not even responsible for the mess that we're leaving them now, but they are responsible for tomorrow. And we cannot, when we fail them as parents and as educators, if we don't equip them with the tools to understand the past and the present, because they won't be ready to deal with the problems that they're going to have to solve in the future.
Thank you. Nicole, I know you had your hand up earlier.
Yes, I did. Thank you so much, John. And thank you, Dr. Jeffries. And, I am a D&I practitioner as well. And one of the things that I've noticed over the past several months of having these types of grounding conversations on understanding the terms, and then we get into, how do we make things better? How do we shift and change? I've been reading and focusing a lot on this idea of the principle implementation gap. That there's the difference between what people believe in and say that they believe in, and their actual implementation of those beliefs, the practices. So while we talk about the value of diversity and equity and inclusion, and I think you referenced this some in your talk, and all can hold hands and agree that it's incredibly important for our schools, for our community, for our society at large, but not necessarily able to implement it in our daily practices, whether that's in the schools and in our communities and our workplaces, et cetera. So I'd love to hear from you around how are you coaching and educating people around the recognition that our values are one thing, or our principles are one thing, but how we actually implement them and engage in a difference in behavior is another thing. So how do you actually inspire people to put their values into practice?
Yeah, Nicole, no, thank you so much for bringing that up, because that is really where we want to be, right? We want to, we have to talk the talk, right? I mean, we have to talk about systemic racism. We have to talk about inequity. We have to talk about inequality. We have to name the issues. We have to name the problems. And we have to agree to say, you know what, we want to build a better, more equitable society. Like, that is a critical starting point, because we can't get there if we can't even agree that that is a goal, right? We can't get there if we can't even agree on a certain set of obstacles that continue to exist and inform society. So we got to do some talking. We got to have some honest conversations. So we got to we got to talk the talk. But you're absolutely right. That ain't it. It's not over. The work has to be in the action. We have to walk the walk too. And why is that so difficult? If you thought talking the talk was difficult, right? Like, wait till you get to having to do the work. Now, this is what Black folk, the funniest thing, and this is across the board. I can't, there was one time I had a group of students, young brothers, who at Ohio State University, and they were excited. So this isn't just something that, this is white folk, right? They were like, look, Dr. Jeffries, we've been in your civil rights classes. We're ready to lead the revolution. And I'm like, okay, very good. So they come into I said, meet me in my office. So they come into my office and they're like, okay, Dr. Jeffries, we're ready to lead the revolution. And I was like, all three of y'all brothers? And they were like, yes, all three of us. I was like, one, ain't no sisters here, so ain't no revolution gonna happen, right? So you need to reimagine what this revolution is gonna be. Go back, get some sisters, come back, and then we can have a conversation. But they did some work, and they went out and they had a march and demonstrations talking about some critical issues on society. They were doing some work. And then they came back and they were a little disappointed because they didn't have every, campus is 50,000 people and they had 50, right? And they were like, oh, Dr. Jeffries, people aren't ready. And I was like, you don't need 50,000, you got 50, that's enough. Then they come back a week later and they're like, oh, we're tired. I'm like, you're tired? It's been 7 days. How are you gonna be tired? The work hasn't even started. You got people been doing this for 50 years. So one, it takes energy, right? This isn't a summer project, right? Like, this is a lifelong way of walking through the world. And so we can't get tired no matter who you are. Is it exhausting? Yes, but you can't give up. You got to do some self-care. You got to take some breaths. You can't be on 24 hours a day. You got to pause for a second, watch some basketball or something, go out, take a walk in the park, but then you have to get back to the work. So one, it is a long haul. It takes it also takes a conscious effort. This isn't something that you just can say, oh, it's just going to happen, right? Because the walk, this is the last thing. I told myself I was only going to answer this in 30 seconds, but it is what it is. So the walk is critical because, we think that too often we think that time itself will lead to change, right? Like, if we just give it time, things will change. I understand that racism is a problem, but the way to deal with it is just to let time pass. But time is not a social force capable of creating change. Time is just a unit of measure. And if we do not act, things won't change. So it is not enough just to think it and to talk it and articulate it. Nicole, you're absolutely right. We have to figure out what work can we do in our own spheres of influence, because just saying it isn't going to bring it into being.
Dr. Jeffries, thanks. We're kind of at an end of time, but I feel compelled to go for a couple more questions if you've got the time, Dr. Jeffries. I want to honor your time tonight too. Are you able to stay for just another couple of minutes?
No, I appreciate it. I'm in a hotel in New York City. I ain't going nowhere. I'm quarantined. Right. We can go all night.
Anybody on the call, feel free, if you need to step out because of other commitments, feel free to do that. Don't feel compelled to have to stay in the setting. And we're recording this too, so you could come back and catch the end of this at another time if you want. But let's, Jared, I see your hand, but let me step over to Patrick and ask one question from a student. There's a student that has a question, then Jared will come back to you here in just a second. So Patrick, if you wouldn't mind sharing one of our student questions.
Yes, absolutely. What should you feel if you were born after 2000 and all of these things happened before you were born and you were never involved in them? Like, how should you be responding or reacting?
Well, first, you should feel young, because I feel old when you talk about you're born after 2000. But I understand the question, and it is a very important question. How should we feel? How should anybody feel about hard history that happened before they were born? One, you should feel bad about it, right? I mean, you should empathize with those who have been victims of injustice, no matter who they are, right? I mean, so you should feel something, right, about this sense of injustice, but you shouldn't feel responsible, right? Because you're not responsible for anything that has happened before you were born. You're not even responsible at age 18, 17, 18 in high school for any of the conditions that exist in the world in which you live. You have no responsibility for that. You can empathize with it. You can try to understand it. You can try to make sense of it. And when you see inequality, it should make you feel bad. It doesn't matter who that is directed at, whether it's people of color, whether it's folk because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. If they are being treated unfairly, we should feel bad about that. So that is fine, but we shouldn't feel any responsibility for that action. But now, this is where the responsibility, this is where how we should feel sort of going forward, or you as a student going forward. You do bear responsibility for the future. Like, that is on you. Like, you are responsible for what happens in the future. So you can't now, right, at this age of, once you sort of move out of the age of innocence and move out of your parents' home and begin to move into adulthood, like 20 years from now, find me when Zoom is holographic images and say, well, Dr. Jeffries, how should I feel about the last 20 years? And I'm like, well, what you been doing, right? Because that's on you at that point. And if you don't begin to do the things to help create an equitable society, well, then I think we may have made some choices that I think should have been made a little bit differently. Now, that doesn't mean that you are responsible. For example, if we're taking the issue of climate change, right? Like, if we're still wrestling with climate change 20 years from now, and you know, you're not responsible individually, you know, for solving the issue. But what can you do individually? What can you do in your chosen field of your chosen career down the road that can contribute to making a better society? And I think what we are, even at this age, even at your age now, in high school or younger, what you do have a responsibility for, again, not responsible for that, you do have a responsibility to try to learn. You do have a responsibility to try to become informed, so that when you get to that age where you are having that broader influence on society, you can seriously, you can make that from a position of strength, an informed position. Now, this last thing I'll say that, you know, you also don't have to wait, you know, 20 years to have an impact on society. One thing we learned from the civil rights movement, that young people are the ones who led the charge. Kids who were not just in college, kids who were in high school, kids who were younger in Birmingham, Alabama, kids who were 7, 8, 9 years old who were taken to the street. So if you see an injustice, even at a tender age, you know, you raise your hand, figure out what's going on, and think about ways that you can address it and have an impact in your own world. So you don't need to wait, but you also don't need to shoulder that burden of the past. And that is, no matter if you're white, and you're thinking about the ways in which you may individually benefit from white privilege, or if you're a person of color, African American, like me, who's a descendant of enslaved folk, right? Like, I don't look back at the past and be like, oh my God, please don't tell me another story about slavery. I look back at the past and be like, you know what? If it wasn't for my ancestors enduring that horror, I wouldn't be here today, right? So again, we don't shoulder, we carry that cultural baggage with us, but we're not necessarily responsible for packing that baggage. But we are going to have to do some unpacking. It's getting late now. I'm talking about bags and stuff. We are going to have to do some unpacking down the road, and you're going to be on your own when it comes to doing it at that time.
Thanks. I think that's a really important question just from our kids. Like, how do I talk to my grandfather about these topics?
Yeah.
You know, where we don't agree on any of this kind of thing. And so it's important, I think, for all of our viewers to know that Dr. Jeffries has scheduled one whole community forum just to focus in on how do we talk to our kids about this stuff. So we'll have this whole thing that we're on right now. We'll have a whole entire night just dedicated to how do we have this conversation back and forth with our own children. Jared, go ahead.
So my question is, what are some good or concrete next steps that the average person can do where we can actually achieve the equity and the justice that you're talking about? Like, just practically speaking, what are some things you can think of?
Well, I think one of the first things that we have to do, individuals have to do, is take the time to do some learning, right? Is because it's not enough just to, like, all of these conversations are really entry points, right? Like entry points to having further conversations, entry points to hopefully begin a process of introspection. So how we are thinking about this world and the past, but then also what we can do. So I think the first step is, and we're all at different stages of knowledge. We all know different things. It's to say, okay, what don't I know? What do I think I know and what don't I know? And then begin that process of learning. And this isn't, that doesn't mean, pick a Black friend and ask them what they're reading, right? I mean, look, do a little homework, right? There are lots of, and it also doesn't mean, oh my God, this is like the Oprah after hour now, since we're after 8:30. Right after, a month after, weeks after the George Floyd was killed, and literally tens of millions of people are taken to the streets, and people are reflecting, right? So Brother Jared, this is what we want, right? People to reflect and figure out, okay, what do I need to read? What do I need to watch? And I teach film, so what documentaries can I watch and movies that I can do some learning, right? And they're turning to Netflix. And rather than watching 13th, which is about mass incarceration and criminal justice, the #1 trending film on Netflix 1 week after the murder of George Floyd was The Help. The Help, right? Like, that ain't helpful, right? That's not what we need. And so the process of learning is not just, grab whatever is on TV. It's informed learning, right? Doing a little homework to figure out, okay, I mean, you can Google it, right? Like sort of racial equity scholarship. Like, what is it that I need to learn? Good movies. I wrote the whole article, essay on good movies about the civil rights movement. So I think individually, a first step, you got to do some learning, right? Take the time, right, to figure some stuff out. But then we move to the point that Nicole was saying, what's the action step, right? I think one of the first things we can do before we get to the act is the sharing what we learn, right? To have those conversations, John, as you were talking about, with those who are around us, taking the measurement. Where are people who are in my world? What are they thinking about? What are their attitudes? What are their beliefs? All right, and how is that impacting and informing mine? And now, after doing a little bit of learning, what do I think about what I am hearing? What am I seeing differently, right? So doing a little homework, having some conversations and some tough conversations, and then the next step is the action, right? So what can we do? I get that question a lot, especially from students, from young people, like, Dr. Jeffries, what should I do? I feel this way. And my initial response is, well, what is it that you are passionate about? Like, what is it that you feel sort of a real draw to? Because for some people, like me, it may be education. And for, maybe for educators. For others, it's the environment, right? And for others, it's culture, right? Like, I'm just passionate about dance. It's like, okay, well, let's see in the realm of the humanities and dance, how can you make a difference, right? Not only in the kinds of performance, but who's going to your studio, what kinds of action and interaction are you having? Where are you having your performances? How can you talk to your dance instructors? Or if you're a dance instructor, what new students can you bring in? And so I think the question to what is next is really, the answer to that is, what do you want to do? And then within that, you figure out, okay, I've learned some stuff. I've talked about some stuff and learned some more. Now I'm looking at my world and I'm seeing, and especially what I'm most interested in, I'm seeing where I can make a difference. And if we all made a little bit of a difference in those places where we are most passionate about, I am convinced that we would actually create a different world. And so we don't have to lead a revolution, right? Like, the people say, well, I'm not really cut out for marching. Well, then don't march. We don't need everybody marching, right? But you have a conversation. You begin to think about what you can do in your neighborhood, right? It doesn't matter what it is, so much as it is that you're doing something that you want to do. Because if you don't have the passion to sustain it, then it won't be sustained. And we need, we don't need, we don't need sprinters, right? Like, we need long distance runners. This has to be a new way of engaging and interacting with the world. And the only way you do that is if you're really passionate about the area in which you're committing your time to. And so that's kind of like, so in essence, I was like, I don't know, right? But only because, right, I think it's a very individual decision, right? It's not that, we don't know that I can't tell somebody what to do next. I can just say, look, do it, right? Whatever it is, do it. Even your physical sport, do it. That's what we need in the end.
Jared, there was a couple of things for me too. When Dr. Jeffries was talking earlier about where you live is like one of the biggest determinators in terms of where you go in life kind of thing. And if I think about that phrase you used earlier, that was, I think you said safety from poverty. And we've got a couple of awesome organizations in New Albany that we could get connected to. As I think about these viewers right now, if we could get everybody connected to the New Albany Food Bank that's currently serving our families that live in poverty, hundreds of our own kids from New Albany Plain Local Schools. If I think about New Albany Neighborhood Bridges, this group that goes out and finds you a bed when you need a bed. This thing where you throw in the need and within 24 hours, your need is met. Those sort of non-academic barriers. We've got two great groups in a really practical kind of way we could connect in our community that would help just sort of ease the pain for some of that poverty that's out there too.
And especially, John, if I could add,
yeah,
especially at this moment in time where we know poverty rates are surging, where critical need, where people are losing their homes, right? Because of, COVID-19 here in Central Ohio. I mean, just look at, the food pantries and food banks. We see that critical need. So, just to put an asterisk on your point, this is not something that we have the luxury of sitting back and saying, let me figure this out and, I'll act down the road. This is, racism, inequality, poverty, hunger, homelessness is something that is urgent. So the fierce urgency of now. And the only reason why any of that exists, the only reason why we have people who are hungry in the United States is because we choose for people to be hungry in the United States. That's a decision that we have made as a society to say that that is okay. And it's not okay. And so it's incumbent upon us to support those organizations that are already doing the work to see if we can try not only to help people through it, but eventually to eradicate it.
Well, Dr. Jeffries, I can't thank you enough for your time tonight. I think this has been a great format in terms of the way that we did this, to hear from you first, get a chance to learn from your knowledge and your background and your expertise, and then to be able to engage in some discussion. So thanks for letting us go a little extra long tonight. I want to honor everybody's time, but I also want to honor everybody's questions too. So I'm letting you know that if you've written a question to galloway.1@naples.us, or if you haven't had the opportunity to ask your question yet, if you send your question to Patrick at galloway.1@naples.us, we'll answer that question. So we want you to know that your question is not going to the wayside. We're going to take a look at it and make sure that we have the opportunity to confer with Dr. Jeffries on this and respond to you. Thank you so much for everybody's time tonight as viewers, but Dr. Jeffries, a very special thank you to you for your time tonight. And we're looking forward to the ones coming up here the rest of this year.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I appreciate everyone's patience as well as their questions and contributions. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue as we move forward and do this work together.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night. We'll catch you at the next one. Good night.